The DNA test burned in my husband's hands before I could read the results. David, the man who swore to protect our son, just turned my world to ash. Now I'm holding a charred scrap of paper with a login to something I shouldn't see. Something that proves my family was never what I thought. The black SUV that nearly crushed me against the guardrail? That was just the beginning. They're coming for me. And I have no idea who they really are. I spent 15 years building a perfect life. One matchstick, and it's all gone. The forensic lab David used doesn't test paternity, it hides fortunes. My son's birth certificate might as well be written in blood. The only man who can help me is a PI from my past, and even he doesn't know what we're up against. The login in my pocket is the key. The problem? It's already too late. The smell of singed cardstock stung Sarah's nostrils as David shoved the brass poker deeper into the hearth. A corner of the document curled, blackening into a brittle lace before the orange tongue swallowed the word paternity. She reached out, her fingers twitching against the velvet upholstery of the armchair, but her muscles refused to move. The fire roared, fueled by the secrets she had spent 3 weeks chasing through hushed phone calls and intercepted mail. David's silhouette loomed against the flickering amber light, his shoulders rigid under his ironed charcoal shirt. He didn't turn. He leaned into the stone mantel, his knuckles white. The heavy silence of the living room sucked the air from her lungs. Outside, a branch scraped against the window pane like a fingernail. "David, stop," she whispered. The words were brittle, cracking under the weight of the smoke. He pivoted, the poker clattering against the grate. A single bead of sweat traced the line of his jaw. "It's gone, Sarah. It never existed. I saw the lab seal. I saw Leo's name. You saw a piece of paper." He stepped toward her, his polished Oxfords muffled by the Persian rug. He smelled of expensive sandalwood and wood smoke. He reached for her hand, his grip firm, dry, and terrifyingly steady. "Leo is a Miller. This family remains a family because I say it does. Do you understand?" Sarah pulled her hand away, the friction stinging her skin. Ash drifted through the air, settling on the glass coffee table like gray snow. She gazed into the dying embers, searching for a single scrap of white. But only the glowing skeletons of her certainty remained. David adjusted his cufflinks, the metallic click punctuating the end of the conversation. He walked toward the hallway, leaving her alone with the stench of burnt ink. The house felt cavernous once the front door clicked shut, signifying David's departure for his early rounds at the hospital. Sarah didn't sleep. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 3, then 4, its heavy thud vibrating through the floorboards like a heartbeat. She waited until the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly yellow through the blinds before she moved. She retreated to David's home office, a room that always smelled of old paper and the sharp, medicinal tang of rubbing alcohol. It was a sterile sanctuary. She began with a mahogany desk, her fingers trembling as she slid open the heavy drawers. She wasn't looking for a file. David was too smart for that. She was looking for the ghost of the truth. She checked the lining of his medical bags, the leather cool and pebbled under her fingertips. She sifted through discarded receipts, her eyes scanning for any mention of the private clinic she suspected he'd used. Hours bled into one another. The air in the office grew stale, thick with the dust she disturbed. Just as she was about to give up, her hand brushed against a vintage leather briefcase tucked behind a stack of medical journals. Inside, nestled in the velvet crevice of the hinge, was a tiny, jagged scrap of paper. It was charred at the edges, rescued from the very fire that had consumed her peace of mind. On it, written in David's precise, surgical hand was a string of characters, a login and a web address for a forensic firm she didn't recognize. The ink was slightly smeared, but the letters were legible. It was a key. A way back into the room David had tried to burn down. Sarah didn't wait for the caffeine to kick in. She grabbed her coat and drove through the morning fog to a diner on the edge of town, a place where the air was heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and grease. Mike Davis was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a decade, his jacket smelling of stale tobacco and the cheap peppermint he used to mask it. "You look like hell, Sarah," Mike said, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the sizzle of the griddle. He reached for a sugar packet, his fingers moving with a practiced, obsessive rhythm as he aligned it with the edge of the laminate table. "I need you to look at this," she said, sliding the charred scrap across the table. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. "It's a login for a forensic lab. David used them for a DNA test, and then he burned the results in front of me." Mike picked up the scrap, squinting at the faded ink. He pulled out another sugar packet, Joe's Diner, 2018, and laid it next to the note. Sarah felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. That was his signal, the bad news signal. "Sarah, this isn't a standard clinic," Mike whispered, leaning in. "This is a high-end forensic outfit. They don't just do blood work, they do discreet asset protection. They're the people billionaires hire when they want to make sure a problem stays buried. Bypassing their security is like trying to break into a vault with a toothpick. It's a legal minefield. If we get caught poking around here, your law license won't just be suspended, it'll be shredded." "I don't care about the license, Mike. I care about my son. I need to know whose blood is in his veins." Mike sighed, the sound deflating his chest. "I'll see what I can do. But keep your head down. David isn't just playing doctor anymore. He's playing for keeps." As Sarah pulled out of the diner parking lot, the morning sun was finally beginning to burn through the mist. She checked her rearview mirror, a habit born of a decade of legal practice. A black SUV was idling near the exit. When she turned onto the main highway, it followed. The vehicle accelerated, a wall of dark glass and chrome looming in her mirror. Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The SUV lunged forward, the roar of its engine vibrating through her seat. It clipped her rear bumper, a sharp, metallic thud that sent a jolt of adrenaline through her spine. She was being pushed toward the shoulder, toward a deep construction ditch lined with jagged concrete pipes. She didn't scream. Her mind went into professional mode, calculating the physics of the skid. She waited for the SUV to lunge again, and just as the front fender aimed for her rear tire, she slammed on the brakes and jerked the wheel to the left. Her sedan shrieked, the smell of burning rubber filling the cabin as she spun across 3 lanes of traffic. The SUV, unable to compensate, barreled past her, its tires kicking up a cloud of red dust as it swerved to avoid a semi-truck. Sarah didn't stop to see who was driving. She floored the gas, weaving through the morning commute until she reached the crowded parking lot of a suburban shopping mall. She sat in the car, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the vibration of the engine still humming in her bones. She was alive, but the message was clear. The truth was guarded by more than just fire. The following evening, the house was unnervingly quiet. David had returned home early, acting as though the previous night's confrontation had been nothing more than a minor disagreement over the dinner menu. He had prepared a meal, salmon with a lemon butter sauce that smelled sickly sweet. "We need to move past this, Sarah," David said, his voice smooth and hypnotic. He sat across from her, his unblinking eyes fixed on her face. For the sake of the family. For Leo. He reached under the table and produced a gift-wrapped box. The paper was a shimmering silver, the bow tied with surgical precision. I saw how upset you were about the accident in the hallway. I wanted to make it right. Sarah's fingers felt numb as she tore the paper. Inside was the large family portrait that usually hung above the piano. The glass was shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds, the shards biting into the canvas where her own face had been. "You broke it, Sarah," David said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. "Don't you remember? You had one of your episodes. You were screaming about the light and you threw your glass at it. I spent an hour cleaning up the mess while you slept." "I didn't break this, David. I wasn't even in the hallway. Your memory is becoming so fragile, Sarah. It's the stress. The way you've been acting. It's starting to worry the neighbors. Even Leo noticed. He asked me why Mom was crying at the walls." He reached across the table and touched her forearm, his grip firm. "I'm the only one who can protect you from yourself, Sarah. You need to trust the process." The gaslighting felt like a physical weight, a suffocating blanket. She looked at the shattered portrait and then back at David's calm, sterile smile. She realized then that he wasn't just trying to hide a secret. He was trying to erase her mind. Desperation drove her to the forensic firm's headquarters the next morning. It was a building of glass and white marble, a place that felt like a vacuum. She had managed to corner a junior clerk, a young man named Robert who looked like he was drowning in his oversized hoodie. "I just need the digital backup for file 88 Delta," Sarah whispered, sliding an envelope across the laminate counter in the break room. It contained $5,000 in cash, money she'd withdrawn from her private savings. "Just a copy on a drive. No one has to know." Robert looked at the envelope, then at Sarah. He began to hum, a low, vibrating funeral dirge that made the hair on her arms stand up. "The truth is a burden," he muttered, his eyes fixed on his shoes. Before he could touch the money, the door swung open. 2 men in dark suits stepped in, followed by a woman Sarah recognized from a rival firm. "Mrs. Miller," the woman said, her voice like ice. "I am Jennifer Taylor. I represent the interests of this facility. You are currently attempting to solicit confidential records through bribery." She handed Sarah a thick legal folder. "This is a cease and desist order. If you contact any employee of this firm again, or if you attempt to access these servers, we will file a formal complaint with the state bar. Your career is already on life support, Sarah. Don't pull the plug yourself." The trap had been perfect. David hadn't just predicted her move, he had choreographed it. Sarah returned home that night to find the driveway empty. The LED streetlights turned the grass a jaundiced green. She walked to the front door and pressed her thumb to the scanner. Access denied. She tried the backup code. Access denied. She hammered on the heavy oak door, the sound echoing through the quiet cul-de-sac. "David, open the door." Silence. She walked around to the back, her heels sinking into the manicured lawn. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the kitchen, she saw them. David was sitting at the island, helping Leo with his calculus homework. He was smiling, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Leo looked up, laughed at something his father said, and went back to his equations. They looked like a postcard of American stability. Neither of them looked toward the window. They acted as if she didn't exist, as if the glass was a one-way mirror into a life she no longer belonged to. Sarah spent the night in her car, the cold leather of the seats biting into her skin. She watched the lights in the house go out one by one until only the porch light remained, casting a long, mocking shadow across the driveway. The next evening, the air was stagnant and heavy, the temperature in the garage hovering near 95 degrees. Sarah had managed to get back into the house through a side window she'd left unlatched, but she felt like a burglar in her own home. She had gone to the garage to find her old files, the ones she'd kept from her days as a prosecutor. The smell of old cardboard and motor oil was suffocating. As she reached for a box labeled Financials, a shadow detached itself from the corner. A man in a dark hoodie and a surgical mask lunged at her. He didn't say a word. He grabbed her by the hair, slamming her back against the brick wall. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, leaving a metallic tang of blood on her tongue. He reached for a bundle of zip ties on the workbench. Adrenaline, sharp and cold, flooded her system. She didn't reach for his face. She reached for her briefcase, a heavy leather toomey she'd carried for a decade. She swung it with every ounce of strength she had, the metal clasp catching the assailant across the temple. The man groaned, his grip loosening. Sarah didn't hesitate. She swung again, the briefcase thudding against his ribs. He fell back, tripping over a stack of boxes. He scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from beneath his mask, staining the concrete floor. He ducked under the half-open garage door and vanished into the darkness of the neighborhood. Sarah collapsed against the car, her chest heaving. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone. As she looked down at the floor where the struggle had happened, something caught the light. A set of keys. They were attached to a distinctive vintage keychain, a brass compass with a jagged scar across the glass. Sarah's heart stopped. She knew that keychain. She had bought it for Mark Stevens 15 years ago in a small shop in Brooklyn, back when they thought they could outrun the world. Mark was the man she had loved before David, the man she had defended in a case she eventually lost, the man whose son she had always feared Leo might be. She picked up the keys, the cold metal biting into her palm. Mark wasn't just a ghost. He was the weapon David was using to finish her off. She didn't call the police. She knew they wouldn't listen, not with David's influence. Instead, she used the GPS tracker on the key fob, a feature she'd insisted Mark install years ago when he was prone to losing things. The signal led her to a dilapidated motel on the edge of the city, a place where the neon sign hummed a broken, buzzing tune. She sat in her car, hidden behind a dumpster, and watched. 10 minutes later, a silver sedan pulled into the lot. David stepped out, his charcoal suit looking wildly out of place in the grime of the motel. Mark Stevens emerged from room 114. He was older, his face lined with the bitterness of his years in prison, a jagged scar running through his eyebrow. He looked at David, not with hostility, but with the weary compliance of a man who had been bought. They shook hands. David handed him a thick envelope, the same kind of envelope Sarah had tried to use to bribe the clerk. They spoke in low tones for a moment, the sound of their voices drowned out by the rhythmic jackhammer of a nearby road crew. The betrayal was total. David hadn't just found out about her past. He had recruited it. He was paying the only man Sarah had ever truly trusted to help him dismantle her life. The 4th of July arrived with a heat that felt like a physical blow. The neighborhood was draped in red, white and blue, a festive shroud for the carnage Sarah knew was coming. David had spent the morning humming as he polished his gold watch. "We're having a guest of honor tonight, Sarah," he said, adjusting his tie in the mirror. "An old friend of yours, Mark Stevens. He's fallen on hard times, and I thought it would be a Christian gesture to invite him to the gala. We should show him what a real family looks like, shouldn't we, Sarah?" The gala was held at the community center, a building that smelled of cloying lilies and expensive perfume. The elite of the neighborhood moved in a sea of silk and gold jewelry, their smiles as sharp as bared teeth. Sarah felt like she was walking through a dream. She stood by David's side, her hand resting on his arm as he introduced Mark to their neighbors. Mark stood with his arms tightly crossed, his fingers tapping a rhythmic pattern of 4 on his thigh. Tap, 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 tap. It was the sound of a countdown. "You look well, Sarah," Mark said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "David tells me you've been having a hard time lately. Memory issues." It's a shame. The humiliation was a slow-acting poison. Every time she tried to speak, David would squeeze her arm, a silent command to stay in her role. She was the unstable wife, the woman who needed to be managed. She waited until David was cornered by Amanda Wilson, the neighborhood's self-appointed moral compass. Sarah slipped away, moving through the crowd like a shadow. She knew David's laptop would be in the private study he'd reserved for business calls during the event. The study was cool and dark, the heavy oak furniture absorbing the distant sound of the brass band outside. She found the laptop on the desk. To her shock, it was open. David's arrogance was his only flaw. He didn't think she had the courage to look. She began to scroll. It wasn't just medical records. It was a digital map of their destruction. David had been systematically draining their joint accounts for 6 months, routing the money through a shell company called Miller Stevens Holdings. He was preparing to leave her with nothing but the debt and the shame. She pulled a USB drive from her clutch and plugged it in. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 10%. 20%. The smell of sandalwood hit her before she heard the door close. "I expected better from you, Sarah," David said. He was standing in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hall. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was far worse. "You're stealing from us, David," she said, her voice trembling. "From Leo. I'm protecting the assets from a woman who is clearly unfit to manage them," he countered, walking toward the desk. "Look at you, sneaking around in the dark, stealing files. What do you think the board will say when they see this?" He lunged for the laptop. Sarah grabbed it, pulling it back. They struggled, the heavy mahogany desk groaning under their weight. David was stronger, his fingers digging into her wrists with surgical precision. He pinned her against the desk, his face inches from hers. "Give it to me, Sarah." "No." With a sudden, violent jerk, she managed to kick him in the shin. He grunted, his grip loosening for a second. She yanked the USB drive from the port and shoved it into the hidden pocket of her silk dress just as he slammed the laptop shut. He stood over her, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He smoothed his hair and straightened his cufflinks. "It doesn't matter," he whispered. "The money is already gone. And so are you." He pulled his phone from his pocket and showed her the screen. It was a copy of a police report, time-stamped 4 hours ago. "I've already filed it, Sarah. Corporate fraud, embezzlement. I've provided the paper trail showing you've been siphoning funds from your firm into an account held by Mark Stevens. Blackmail, they'll call it. Or perhaps just a lover's gift. Either way, the police are on their way to the gala to pick you up." The world tilted. The trap wasn't just financial. It was a cage made of her own history. David had used the very law she loved to bury her. Subverted. Sarah stood frozen, the silk of her dress feeling like a shroud. Her mind, usually a sharp instrument of logic, scrambled for a foothold. "Think, Sarah. Think." She had the USB drive. She had the evidence of his transfers. If she could just get to the authorities first, if she could explain the shell company, she could flip the narrative. She decided to play the only card she had left. She wouldn't run. She would confront him here, in front of everyone. David hated a scene. He valued the sterile image of their life above all else. If she forced the truth into the light of the gala, his carefully constructed facade would crack. "You won't do it, David," she said, her voice regaining its professional edge. "Because if you call the police, I'll tell them about the forensic lab. I'll tell them about the tampered DNA results. You're a surgeon. Your reputation is your life. Do you really want to be the man who faked a paternity test to gaslight his wife?" David paused. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. He looked at the door, then back at her. "You have no proof of that." "I have the login, David. I have the scrap of paper you failed to burn." He seemed to deflate. He sat down in the heavy leather chair, his head in his hands. "Fine. What do you want?" "The police report. Retract it. Now. Tell them it was a mistake, a misunderstanding of the accounts. Do it, and I'll give you the drive." Relief washed over her. It was working. Her logic, her ability to negotiate under pressure, it was saving her. David picked up his phone, his fingers moving slowly. "I'm calling the precinct now. I'll tell the sergeant I found the missing funds in a secondary trust." Sarah watched him speak into the phone, her heart rate slowing. She had won. She had outmaneuvered the man who thought he was God. David hung up and looked at her with a weary smile. "It's done, Sarah. They're closing the file. Let's go out there and finish the night. For Leo." She nodded, her shoulders dropping for the first time in weeks. She followed him out of the study and back into the crowded ballroom. The music was playing a patriotic march, the brass instruments bright and triumphant. She felt a surge of hope. She would take Leo, leave tonight, and never look back. She saw the two uniformed officers standing by the buffet table. They weren't looking at the food. They were looking at her. "Mrs. Miller?" the taller officer asked, stepping forward. "It's okay," Sarah said, a confident smile on her face. "My husband just called the precinct. There was a misunderstanding with the accounts." The officer didn't smile back. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic clink was the loudest sound in the room. "We didn't get a call about a misunderstanding, ma'am. We got a call from Dr. Miller 10 minutes ago, stating that you were currently in the study attempting to destroy the digital evidence of your embezzlement. He said you were becoming violent." Sarah spun around to look at David. He was standing a few feet away, his face a mask of tragic concern. He was holding his phone out to the guests, showing them a video, one he must have recorded in the study. It showed Sarah screaming, "I'll destroy you," as she grabbed for the laptop. He had edited it, stripped away his own provocations, leaving only her desperation. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," David said, his voice loud enough for the Wilsons to hear. "I tried to help you. I tried to cover for you. But I can't be complicit in this anymore." The truth hit her like a physical blow. The call to the precinct had been a sham. He had never intended to retract the report. He had used the negotiation to bait her into a recorded outburst that proved his claims of her instability. She hadn't outsmarted him. She had walked directly into the center of his web. The handcuffs bit into her wrists, the cold metal a final, crushing weight. As they led her through the crowd, past the shocked whispers and the clinking of Amanda Wilson's gold bracelets, Sarah saw Mark Stevens standing by the exit. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor, his fingers tapping that same rhythmic countdown. 1, 2, 3, 4. She had lost everything. Her career, her reputation, and her son. And she had handed David the keys to the cell herself. The police station was a place of peeling linoleum and the constant, weary hiss of a radiator. Sarah sat in the interrogation room for hours, the fluorescent lights making her eyes ache. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She waited. She was released on bail the next morning, thanks to a favor from a former colleague who still owed her. She didn't go to a hotel. She went back to the house. She knew David would be at the hospital, and Leo would be at his summer internship. She stood in the kitchen, the morning sun mocking her with its brightness. She looked at the fireplace, at the gray soot that was all that remained of the DNA test. And then, she saw it. On the counter was a legal pad. On it, Leo had been practicing his calculus. But in the corner, in the small, cramped handwriting of a boy who was trying to be invisible, were the words, "Why is my real father here?" The air left Sarah's lungs. Leo knew. He had seen Mark Stevens at the gala, and he had recognized the truth in the man's face, or perhaps in the way they both tapped their fingers when they were nervous. The realization gave her a new kind of strength, a cold, sharp clarity. She wasn't just a victim. She was a lawyer. And she knew the one thing David had forgotten. The shell company, Miller Stevens Holdings, wasn't just a vehicle for fraud. It was a legal entity she had personally incorporated for a client years ago. A client who had gone bankrupt and left the company dormant. David had hijacked it, thinking it was a clever bit of irony. But as the incorporating attorney, Sarah still had the master keys to the digital records. She didn't need David's laptop. She just needed a terminal and her own memory. She drove to her office, ignoring the stares of the partners. She sat at her desk and logged into the state's corporate registry. She bypassed the secondary security, the locked door David thought he'd bolted, by using the original administrative codes she'd set up a decade ago. The floodgates opened. She saw every transfer, every signature, every microscopic bit of filth David had tried to wash away. He hadn't just moved money. He had used the shell company to pay the forensic lab to adjust the DNA findings. The final mystery was solved. The original test, the one David had burned, showed that he was the father. He had never doubted it. He had manufactured the doubt to destroy her, to keep her in a state of perpetual uncertainty, so she would never be strong enough to leave him. He had hired Mark Stevens, not because Mark was the father, but because Mark was the only person who could make her believe she was a liar. She printed everything. The bank transfers, the emails to the lab, the payments to Mark Stevens. She didn't go to the police. She went back to the gala venue, where the cleanup was still underway. She knew David would be there, helping Amanda Wilson coordinate the return of the rented equipment, playing the hero one last time. She found him on the lawn, standing under the charred remains of the fireworks display. "Sarah," he said, his voice tight, "you shouldn't be here. You're violating the terms of your release." "I'm not here as your wife, David," she said, her voice echoing across the quiet lawn. "I'm here as the senior partner of Miller and Associates, and I'm here to discuss the unauthorized use of a dormant legal entity for the purposes of money laundering and witness tampering." She handed the folder to Amanda Wilson, who was standing nearby. "Read it, Amanda. See what the hero of the neighborhood has been doing with your donation funds." The silence that followed was absolute. David reached for the folder, but Sarah stepped back. "The police are already on their way, David. And this time, they have the real report. The one with your digital signature on every bribe." David looked at her, his face finally stripping away the mask. The cold, calculating eyes were full of a raw, naked terror. "I did it for us, Sarah. To keep us together." "No," she said. "You did it for the protocol. But you forgot the most important rule of the law, David. The paper trail never lies, even when the people do." As the sirens wailed in the distance, Sarah turned and walked toward her car. She saw Leo standing by the porch of their house, watching the scene. She didn't run to him. She just nodded, a signal that the ground was finally solid again. The American dream was a pile of gray soot on the hearth, but as Sarah watched the police lead David away, she felt a strange, quiet peace. She had lost the house, the reputation, and the life she thought she wanted. But she had kept the truth. And for the first time in 15 years, that was enough.